What happened next would haunt Marcus Reed for the rest of his life. But sometimes fate strikes when you're least prepared for it. The blizzard had been merciless that December morning in 1887, transforming the Colorado mountains into a white tomb. Marcus guided his stallion carefully along the frozen creek bed, the animal's breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter air. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this winter wasteland. At first, it was barely audible over the howling wind, but then it came again, sharp and terrified, a scream for help. Marcus spurred his horse forward, and when he crested the ridge, his blood turned to ice. The young Cheyenne woman had broken through the frozen lake, her body disappearing and reappearing as she fought against the deadly water beneath the ice. Her long black hair whipped across her face as the current tried to drag her under the frozen surface. Her arms flailed desperately, her dark eyes wide with the terrors of someone staring death in the face. But here's what you don't know yet. What Marcus saw next would change everything he believed about survival. Without hesitation, Marcus dove into the frigid water. The cold hit him like 1,000 daggers, stealing his breath. But all that mattered was reaching her before the lake claimed another victim. The current fought him, pulling him toward the deeper darkness, but he lunged forward until his gloved hand locked around her wrist. She gasped when he hauled her up, her body trembling violently, as together they battled toward the shore. Every movement was agony in the freezing water. But finally, Marcus dragged her onto the snowy bank where she collapsed, retching lake water and shaking uncontrollably. For long minutes, she lay motionless, only breathing hard, her eyes darting between Marcus and the tree line as if she couldn't believe she was still alive. Marcus asked her name, but she remained silent, her lips blue with cold, her buckskin dress frozen to her skin. She possessed a raw, haunting beauty, like the untamed wilderness itself, fierce yet fragile. Standing and wringing ice from his coat, Marcus offered his hand. Slowly, cautiously, she accepted it, her fingers small and numb with cold. He thought that would be the end of their encounter. He assumed she'd disappear into the forest, back to her people, and he'd ride away with nothing but the memory of pulling someone from death's embrace. He was completely wrong. When Marcus mounted his horse and began riding toward town, she followed. He told her to return to safety, that she owed him nothing, but she shook her head and walked barefoot through the snow behind him, her expression unreadable. All day she trailed in silence, her presence somehow heavy despite her lack of words. When Marcus made camp that evening, she appeared at the edge of the firelight, watching him as if trying to determine whether he was ally or enemy. He heated beans and dried meat over the flames, and when he offered her some, she accepted quietly, eating with small, careful bites. Her eyes never stopped studying him, as if memorizing every detail. Marcus didn't bombard her with questions, though his skunt burned with curiosity. Why had she been alone at the lake? Where was her family? What circumstances had led her to that frozen death trap? Something about her silence warned him that pressing for answers might shatter something precious. Later that night, under a canopy of winter stars, she finally spoke. Her voice was soft but carried a weight of sorrow that made the mountain air feel heavier. She told him raiders had attacked her village, slaughtering her family and scattering the survivors like leaves in a storm. She had been trying to cross the frozen lake to reach the next settlement when the ice gave way beneath her feet. Wait, because what she said next changed everything. Marcus thought he knew about honor. Her words came in broken fragments, like they were torn from wounds still bleeding, but the meaning was crystal clear. She had lost everything: family, home, future, everything except the desperate will to survive. Then she looked directly at Marcus, her dark eyes steady and unwavering, and said he had given her life back. From that moment, she declared she would never leave his side. Marcus laughed softly, tried to explain that he was no savior, just a drifter passing through these mountains, that she didn't owe him any debt. But she shook her head with quiet certainty. In her eyes, Marcus wasn't just a stranger who happened to pull her from the water. He was a lifeline, a sacred bond she had chosen, and such bonds in her world were never broken lightly. When he woke at sunrise, she was already sitting beside the dying embers, her hair still damp against her shoulders, watching him with something fierce and protective in her gaze. Marcus realized then that no matter how far he traveled, she would be there. He had saved her from drowning, but in doing so, he had bound himself to her forever. What he didn't yet understand was that this was only the beginning of a journey that would test them both beyond anything he could imagine. But you haven't heard the shocking part yet. The following days became a test of patience and understanding. Wherever Marcus went, she was there, walking several paces behind, never asking permission, never demanding anything, simply existing as though her rightful place was beside him. Initially, he tried to convince her to leave, told her she didn't need to shadow his every move, but she ignored every argument. She gathered firewood before he asked, collected water from streams without being told, and sat near their evening fires without speaking, studying him with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. She was young, perhaps 18, but her silence carried a strength, a quiet resilience that made Marcus question whether he had severely underestimated her character. Marcus had always been a solitary man, but the wilderness has a way of forging connections when survival depends on it. And with each passing day she remained with him, that invisible bond grew stronger. They rode through snow-covered pine forests and across windswept plateaus. Then, one afternoon, smoke appeared on the horizon. She stiffened in recognition, whispering that it might be survivors from her village. Against his better judgment, Marcus followed her toward the distant smoke. But what they discovered wasn't a camp of survivors. It was devastation. The ground bore fresh scars of violence. Fires burned to ash, belongings scattered like discarded memories, and the earth churned with evidence of a brutal struggle. She knelt in the frozen dirt, her hands trembling as her fingers touched a broken silver bracelet half buried in the ashes. Marcus had no words of comfort to offer, only respectful silence, until she rose and looked at him with new fear blazing in her eyes. She said she couldn't continue searching alone, and because he had saved her life, he was now part of her sacred path, whether he wanted to be or not. Marcus argued, insisted he was no warrior, but she simply replied, "The spirits have chosen you." And somehow those words silenced his protests more effectively than any weapon could have. Here's where the story takes a turn you won't expect. They pressed deeper into the mountains, and though conversation between them remained sparse, Marcus began understanding her in ways that transcended language. She hummed ancient melodies in her native tongue during the long evenings, whispered prayers to the mountain winds, and carried her grief with a dignity that humbled him completely. One night, under a blood-red moon, the raiders struck without warning. Gunshots shattered the mountain silence, horses screamed in terror, and chaos consumed their small camp. Marcus fought like a desperate animal, his rifle blazing, and beside him she moved with fearless determination, wielding a flaming branch that sent one attacker tumbling from his horse. Together, against impossible odds, they held the raiders off until silence returned, and the night seemed to exhale its held breath. When the battle ended, Marcus saw her standing there, fierce and unbroken, despite everything she'd endured, and realized she was no helpless girl seeking his protection. She was his equal in the fight for survival. Later, as they bandaged wounds by firelight, Marcus asked why she insisted on following him across these dangerous mountains. Her answer was simple, but it cut straight to his soul. "The frozen water gave me life through your hands," she said quietly. "If I leave you, I return to death." Marcus saw then that this was far more than gratitude. It was a bond forged in ice and blood, something sacred to her people. And though he had never asked for such responsibility, he could no longer deny its power. From that night forward, he stopped resisting her presence. Marcus shared stories of his past, the mistakes he'd buried, the faces he could never forget, the reasons he'd chosen a wanderer's life. She listened without judgment, offering only understanding silence. In return, she revealed fragments of her people's ancient traditions, the songs of the old ways, the hopes she still carried despite everything she had lost. Gradually, her silence gave way to trust, and his solitude gave way to something he hadn't felt in years: true companionship. By the time they reached the high country, two shadows stretched side by side wherever they rode. Marcus didn't know what future awaited them in these frozen peaks, or whether they'd ever find other survivors from her village. But he knew his life was no longer entirely his own. He had saved her once from the frozen lake, but now she was the one who gave his existence meaning and purpose. She wouldn't stop following him through these treacherous mountains. And for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Reed didn't want her to. If this winter tale has kept you on the edge of your seat, if you felt the bite of that frozen lake and the weight of survival in the wilderness, then stay with us. There's so much more of their story yet to unfold. Subscribe and journey with us into the next chapter of this mountain adventure.